As I often told people in the days after his death, Elijah's death wasn't just my loss, it was our loss as a nation. And we all have the responsibility to move his legacy forward because we know that with every transgression, every disregard for the Constitution, every attempt to act above the law, every denial of truth, our democracy is endangered. That's why, in the months and years ahead, we must continue to hear Elijah's voice. We're better than this. We're better than this. Yes, we are. We must be.
Good evening and welcome to the library. My name is David Leonard, president of the BPL and host of our Arc of History series. Tonight is the third installation under our 2021 theme of Repairing America and also part of our Author Talk series. Tonight, I'm again coming to you live from the Central Library in Boston's Copley Square, from the Bates Hall Reading Room, where visitors have pursued their research and study interests since 1895. Repairing America as a theme provides us with an opportunity to engage with issues facing our country and try to bend our arc of history a little more directly towards justice for all. It also gives us the opportunity to give voice to leaders, experts, and commentators, many of whom might not always have been afforded such opportunities. Tonight, we are honoring the life and legacy of Congressman Elijah Cummings. Congressman Cummings was born and raised in Baltimore, Maryland, and passed away there on October 17th, 2019. He dedicated his life of service to uplifting and empowering the people he represented. Beginning with the Maryland House of Delegates, where he served 16 years and became the first African American in Maryland history to be named Speaker Pro Tem, first sworn in as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives in 1996, Congressman Cummings proudly represented Maryland's 7th District since 1996. He became ranking member of the House Committee on Oversight and Reform in 2011 and was appointed chairman in 2019. Our guests this evening are Dr. Maya Rockeymoore Cummings, a social entrepreneur, speaker, writer, and strategist who's on a mission to drive society toward inclusion. Maya has appeared in a variety of media outlets such as CBS, CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, and BET, and her writings have been published in the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Huffington Post, and The Washington Post, among other publications. She is the recipient of multiple honors, such as the Aspen Institute Henry Crown Fellowship Award and the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation Fellowship Award, has been a candidate for Maryland governor and the U.S. Congress. She is the widow of the late Congressman Elijah Cummings. Our second guest is Jim Dale. Jim is more often a behind-the-scenes personality as an author collaborator on a number of books on topics including business, medicine, and life lessons. His works include both The Power of Nice with Ron Shapiro and Just Show Up with Cal Ripken Jr. Welcome to you both. I would first like to extend our condolences on the loss of this great man, who we look forward to hearing a little bit more about tonight. And so I would like to invite you both to tell us a bit about how this book came to fruition and also offer you the opportunity to share a reading. Maya, we'll turn to you first.
Thank you, David. Thank you for that kind introduction. And thank you to the Boston Public Library and the GBH Forum Network for hosting this event tonight. We are definitely excited to be with all of you. Elijah was deeply loved and he is sorely missed. When he passed away in October of 2019, we received condolences from all around the country and around the world. And I said that, at the time that, it just shows that the power of CNN, people watching what's happening on C-SPAN and CNN and MSNBC around the country and around the world. And the fact that many people have been fixated about what's happening in Washington, D.C. And its impact, certainly here in the United States, but around the world. And that being said, 8 years ago, I started talking to Elijah about writing his memoirs. He had so many interesting stories to tell, and they fit together in such a wonderful way that I wanted him to share his story. And so we talked about it for a while. I've tried to find a collaborator to help him, and it really didn't come together until about a year before his passing, where I happened to be talking to a friend, and she mentioned that she knew someone who was a collaborator, and it turned out to be Jim. And so I interviewed Jim, and then I introduced Jim to Elijah, and they interviewed, and then began a wonderful collaboration that turned into the book, We're Better Than This, My Fight for the Future of Our Democracy. Now, I've got to tell you that a lot of the people that I have talked to who have read the book actually say that they feel like they're talking to Elijah, that they hear his voice when they read the book. And I think that that's a testament to the expertise of Jim and his writing style and his ability to listen and hear the cadence of the people he's working with. And so with that, I'd love to introduce you to Jim Dale, the collaborator for the book, We're Better Than This.
Thank you so much, Maya. And as she said, Maya was the matchmaker. And Elijah and I did click right away, which was great. He started telling me stories. I started thinking about how to interweave them into the fabric of an entire book. And that began the process. And I will say that, as David said, I've been writing books like this, collaborating, co-authoring for many, many years. But personally, this book and this project, this particular collaboration was without question the most meaningful and indelible experience of my entire writing career. Has not been anything like it. And I will share a story. I'll tell you this, in session after session with Elijah, he would tell me stories. And I began to formulate this structure, the sort of quilted interweaving of the formative moments of his past as the child of sharecroppers, living in segregated neighborhoods, struggling in school, eventually forming the fabric of everything he would do later in life, in Washington and Congress with presidents, quite literally the past informing the present and the future. And early in our writing sessions, I asked Elijah if there was one story in his past that perhaps rose above the rest, that stood out as being the most formative in his life. Without any hesitation, he recounted the following experience, and I'm going to read an excerpt from it. When I was no more than 11 years old, my life was forever altered. I certainly didn't realize it at the time. I knew something important was happening, but it took a long while before the impact really hit me. We had a neighborhood community playground center where the kids would gather in the summer with a small wading pool with some recreation counselors to watch over us. Our little wading pool was no more than a few feet across and very shallow, maybe up to your knees, and filled with kids side by side. You had to take turns a half hour at a time, and after the third group, the water was pretty dirty. But that was the only way we had to get cool on a hot day. And one day in late August, a lady came in and she asked us kids, how would you like to go to a real swimming pool, one with a diving board, an Olympic-sized pool? Well, we all thought that would be great, but how was that going to happen? She said there was a pool like that only a few blocks away from where we were in Riverside Park, and that we deserved to go there. And she was going to take us. She said, you can swim to your heart's delight. Her name was Juanita Jackson Mitchell. And to us, she was just this nice lady who was going to take us to a real swimming pool. We didn't realize until later, she was a civil rights pioneer from a family of civil rights pioneers. The first African-American woman to practice law in Maryland. Juanita Jackson Mitchell's mother was the inspirational Dr. Lillie Jackson, who descended from a signer of the Declaration of Independence, but still had to attend the segregated colored high school. She rose to president of the Baltimore branch of the NAACP, became an early leader in nonviolent protest, and was known as the Mother of Freedom. Her daughter, Juanita, was married to Clarence Mitchell, Jr., a national leader in civil rights and lobbyist for the NAACP, and they in turn were parents of 2 state senators, Michael and Clarence III. Civil rights was practically the family business. What Mrs. Mitchell did not tell us that day about the nice pool she was taking us to was that it was totally segregated, no blacks allowed. She and her colleagues at the rec center, Jim Smith and Walter Black, were leading us on an integration march. There we were, a band of little kids walking down the streets of Baltimore from a black neighborhood into a white neighborhood, only a few blocks from each other, but worlds apart. Day after day, Juanita and Jim and Walter led about 30 of us, walking 10 or 15 blocks, while an angry mob, not of other kids, but of grown white adults, yelled names at us, told us to go home, and threw rocks and bricks at little kids. One of those rocks struck me in the forehead and caused a scar that I carry to this day. The police watched, and the newspapers took pictures, and they ran stories, but nobody stopped the angry residents, but nobody stopped us either. We kids would swim in the Riverside Park pool each day and then leave with the quote unquote neighbors yelling racial epithets and throwing debris and bottles, and white kids pushing black kids in the pool. I call them neighbors ironically. Yes, we all lived within a few blocks of each other, but they were hardly neighborly. They were the opposite, people trying to keep us out of their neighborhood. Tensions were high. After taking Sunday off, they let us all back in on Monday, Labor Day, September 3rd. That day, someone called Walter's associate, Lyle Roberts, a nigger, the hostility escalating. About that time, the Riverside Park citizens, clinging to their segregated white enclave, must have just realized that we were all going to just keep coming back, because they stopped coming to their doorways and onto the streets and shouting and throwing rocks. As Juanita Mitchell promised, we all got to go to a real pool. And as she said, we swam to our heart's delight. Even as little children, we had a sense of victory and fear. We'd gone off to play every day, but we ended up making history. That was in the early 1960s, and old rules and practices and even prejudices began slowly but steadily to change. Baltimore stayed largely segregated for the next 10 years, but it was a beginning, the root of what would evolve into a massive upheaval in social norms, change. For me, that was the beginning of wanting to become somebody who could make things change. I saw that Mitchell and the other people who made integration happen were lawyers. So I wanted to be a lawyer. These lawyers were young men and women who had the courage to walk up the streets and have people yell at them and be unafraid, to have little kids following them, trusting, believing in them, to make change happen. I wasn't sure what a lawyer was, what their job was, but I saw what they could accomplish. Oh my God, what a powerful force that could be. Change. Little black children getting what only white children had because we were, after all just kids, no matter what color, who wanted the same chances in life, the chance to swim in a pool, the chance to go to a good school, or live in a nice neighborhood, or see a better world. I wanted to be part of that change. And I have endeavored to do so ever since. And I've pursued it and pursued it. As for the progress in achieving change, well, here is a fitting postscript. 30 years later, a man came up to me and identified himself as one of those in the angry mob. And he told me he was sorry. What is the right response to justice acknowledged, but so long delayed? I did not applaud his admission, nor did I spurn it. I said, apology accepted. That's the excerpt, but I'll tell you that Elijah said that he never forgot the swimming pool incident. It was truly formative. He said he called upon the memory to fuel his actions in Washington. When he conducted hearings on the Trump immigration policies, separating mothers and children, putting them in cages, telling them to, quote, go back where they came from. When Trump launched his Twitter attack on Cummings' beloved hometown as a disgusting rat and rodent infested mess. When Elijah answered George Stephanopoulos' question, yes, Trump is a racist, no doubt about it. When Elijah walked the streets of Baltimore to calm his city after the senseless death of young Freddie Gray. And at Freddie's funeral, when he asked those watching and listening, did you see him? Did you really see him? You see him in the casket and you see him on the news. But when he walked to school, when he played ball on his neighborhood team, when he sang in the choir, did you see him? Elijah Cummings decried the invisible Black lives so often lost, never really seen. It's stories like this that became the fabric that interwove his life and mission. And now Maya, his wife and partner, who wrote the last chapter of the book after Elijah's death, will talk about that final chapter and his last messages to us and how he may have felt about events that have unfolded since. Maya.
Thank you, Jim. That absolutely was a formative and very important story for Elijah. And when you think about it, I think I want all of us to think. Elijah was born into a segregated Jim Crow South as an African-American man, basically dispossessed by the United States power structure. Blacks, were rendered second-class citizens, if that. They were, prevented from, Elijah and his family were prevented from walking into downtown stores. They couldn't eat in restaurants that were for whites only. Certainly all aspects of his very young life, he was marginalized in. He went to a separate and unequal school. And so when you just think about it, and then think about the trajectory of his life and how he rose to become not just one of the most powerful members of the United States Congress, but one who was a staunch defender of democracy. How was that possible? How is it possible to go from being the ultimate outsider to being the penultimate insider? Someone who was willing to go to the mat to defend our democracy. Now, when you look at the structure of the book, Elijah had two goals for the book. One was to encourage young people to really, aspire high and to, fight through all the obstacles that they were facing in life. He wanted his story to be an example to young people to show that you could have plenty of obstacles like he had, including being labeled special education as a kid, and in addition to being, born Black into a segregated society. But, he wanted to encourage them that if he could get through it, they can get through it too. But the second one was to warn the American people about Donald J. Trump. To warn the American people that this man was not just ill-suited for the position, that he was actually possibly dangerous for our humanity and definitely dangerous for our democracy. And so with that, what we've seen since that time has, Elijah has been proven prophetic. That dangerous is probably not quite the word for it. It's more than that. Someone who is actively seeking to upend our democracy and tear it apart brick by brick. But Elijah's life went to being a champion for democracy because of that pool story, because of the so many other stories of people like John Lewis and Martin Luther King, who basically leveraged the tools of the United States Constitution, the power of assembly, the power of protest, the freedom of speech, to basically challenge the system from within, and then use the tools of the law in order to make American society better than it was before. That was the power that he saw in his own life and how it transformed the lives of people like him across the country. And he felt like if our democracy could do that for him and his family and people who look like him, that it could do it, into the future, that we could indeed become a more perfect union. So he believed that democracy worked. And that is why he fought till his death to make sure that we could hold on to our democracy. Now, he often warned people, democracy is fragile, and if you don't watch out, we can lose it. And we saw on January 6th how we can lose our democracy. If you've got ill-informed people who are holding on to false, narratives, who are, basically seeking to, destroy the heart of our democracy for their, extreme ideological beliefs, then what we've got here is a proposition that could basically, if left unchallenged, could lead to anarchy and the end of the United States as we know it. And so Elijah would not have been surprised about Donald Trump's role in inciting the election, his inability to accept the results of the election first. He would not have been surprised that Donald Trump would have led to the big lie, because, Donald Trump has lied more than 36,000 times since his presidency started. And Elijah notes that in his book. But he wouldn't have been surprised that Donald Trump would continue to lie about losing the election. And then, of course, the events on January 6th would not have surprised him in terms of the incitement. What would have surprised him, unfortunately, were his Republican colleagues, who used to say that they were big defenders of the Constitution, who used to say that they were the ultimate patriots, who used to say that, that they put country over party. But we saw on January 6th and events since then that all of that has been sacrificed at the altar of Donald J. Trump and his cult of personality. And unfortunately, what we're facing in the United States Congress right now is a Republican Party that seems to be, in the service of a personality that is no longer in Washington, but seems to still be certainly controlling the strings of the Republican Party. And so with that, we face a challenge in this country, and this challenge is real. We do need to hold the people accountable who stormed the US Capitol on January 6th, but we also need to hold Donald Trump accountable. And someone needs to hold the majority of Republicans in the House of Representatives and in the Senate who refuse to hold Donald J. Trump accountable for his actions. And so with that, I'd certainly welcome a conversation about these issues. Elijah, of course, would have been saying from the top of his lungs that we're better than this, we need to be better than this. He would have been saying it with a moral force so real that one hopes that his Republican colleagues would have listened. One hopes that even if John Lewis had still been living, that their Republican colleagues would have listened. And now we are at the precipice of something real, something very dangerous. And we need to have the Republicans in Congress listening. And so the question becomes is what will be that force that gets them to listen? And will it happen at the right moment in time?
Thank you both for these opening comments. Was there a particular piece you wanted to read now, or would you like to hold that till a bit later on?
I certainly could if you want me to. I do have a piece here, and that's in the final chapter of the book, which I wrote. It starts after the Democrats regained the majority in the midterms. Elijah was now the chairman of the Committee on Oversight and Reform. He was finally in a position to lead investigations and to set the agenda for hearings. But he was sober about the realities of the threats he and his committee would face from the Trump administration and congressional Republicans. Despite his pain, he threw himself into his work. Then in late summer, just before his speech at the National Press Club, he took yet another bad turn and was readmitted to Johns Hopkins Hospital. The underlying suspicion was that the cancer had come back. Elijah was weaker than I'd seen him in years. A day before he was to give the speech, I asked if he intended to do it. And he said, "Maya, I'll be there if I have to crawl." Elijah was so drained that when his aides maneuvered him to the podium, pale and unsteady, I thought he might drop. Then he looked at the crowd, 4 or 5 times the size of what had been expected. before his investigations into the administration, before the shootings in Dayton and El Paso, and before Trump's Twitter attack on Baltimore and Elijah. He looked at the crowd and you could see him become energized. He exhorted the audience to listen, and more important, to take action. He was passionate as only Elijah Cummings could be. The gathering of usually callous Washington media cheered and gave him a standing ovation. Exhausted and barely able to keep going, he went straight back to the hospital. During the next few weeks, he managed to continue vital work. He was on the phone with Nancy Pelosi, Adam Schiff, Jerry Nadler, and his staff. He read testimony. He reviewed the impeachment updates. He signed subpoenas. So many times I said, Elijah, that's enough for today. Okay, I'll stop soon, he'd say. Doctors at Hopkins and NIH monitored his cancer. It was obviously recurring. The question was, could they do anything to slow it down or limit it? We all did everything we could. There became, I think the best word is, an inevitability to it. He knew, and I suspected, we were coming to the end. It was coming as if you could see it like a train approaching in the distance. When you're not sure how far away it is, but you know it's steadily coming towards you. That's when he began to talk differently. He would say he was tired. No matter how much rest he got, he was just tired all the time. He complained of constant pain. It was clearly physical, but it was also emotional and spiritual. The inner Elijah was burning out. We talked about the past, what Elijah had done, and about the future and all that remained to be done. But we did not use the word death. We just knew. As if sped by his passing, events moved even faster in the days just after Elijah's death. On December 18, 2019, Speaker Nancy Pelosi banged the gavel and announced that the House of Representatives voted 230 to 197, strictly along party lines, to impeach President Donald J. Trump, the third president in the history of the United States to face impeachment charges. That evening, during his press conference, she spoke about Elijah. She honored him as a key force in the inquiry, calling him our North Star. And she quoted him, quote, "When the history books are written about this tumultuous era, I want them to show that I was among those in the House of Representatives who stood up to lawlessness and tyranny," end quote. She added. He also said somewhat presciently, "When we're dancing with angels, the question will be, what did you do to make sure we kept our democracy intact?" We did all we could, Elijah. We passed the 2 articles of impeachment. The president is impeached. As I often told people in the days after his death, Elijah's death wasn't just my loss. It was our loss as a nation. And we all have the responsibility to move his legacy forward, because we know that with every transgression, every disregard for the Constitution, every attempt to act above the law, every denial of truth, our democracy is endangered. That's why, in the months and years ahead, we must continue to hear Elijah's voice. We're better than this. We're better than this. Yes, we are. We must be.
Thank you again. I'd like to start with a couple of questions about the book and then move to the man and then into the issues. I'd like to bring Jim back into the conversation. The book is clearly Elijah's memoir. But Jim, you wrote an introduction. This is unusual for a collaborator and an author. And then Maya, I will ask you a little bit about writing the final chapter as well. So Jim, would you tell us about being asked to actually contribute as yourself to the book as well?
Yes, you're certainly correct. It's out of the ordinary. As a collaborator in this role, that's never done, or almost never. I shouldn't say never because we did it here. But the whole purpose of the collaborator is to bring out the voice of the principal author. But in this particular case, our editor at the publishing company said, we'd like to give the readers a little context because Elijah is no longer with us, to tell the readers about what it was like to work with him. So they don't just see the end product, but they get a little glimpse into what it was like to get there, how you got there. And so in that introduction, I said right away, I don't often do this, almost never, but it's appropriate here because of the circumstances that are so unfortunate. But I was able to tell the readers how much we communicated, how often. Even when he became very ill, we talked or we communicated by email or text. And as Maya said, sometimes he worked long, long hours. I often got text messages that I'd see the timestamp on them. It'd be 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock. And he would then call, or I'd call him at, 9 o'clock the next morning. So you could do the math. There's not a lot of sleep in there. But he was in a hurry to get his message across. We met or talked several times a week. I went to his 2 offices, the one in Baltimore and the one in Washington. I rode back and forth to the Hill with him. And as I said, and we exchanged many emails and text messages. I ended up doing more sessions by phone than one might normally do. And this is pre-COVID. This is just because in order for him to take care of himself as best he could. Sometimes I didn't know it, but he was talking to me from a hospital or from a hospital bed. But he just kept going with writing the story. We had long sessions. I joked about it. The very first session, we were supposed to meet for what I thought would be a half hour. I was there 3 hours. That was a clue that we were clicking and maybe we were going to actually do a book. And that was I remember asking him a question at the end of that session. He asked me a lot of questions about the process of writing a book and how you structure the proposal and who you send it to and how you get it published, all kinds of questions, like a lawyer, like as he was. And at the end of that little chunk of our conversation, I said, writing a book like this is a lot of work, not just for me, but for you. And even though, I'll work around your schedule, it's a burden. And you have a great burden already. And so I said, can you make the time? Do you have the time to write this book? And I say in that introduction, he said to me, I will make the time, Jim. I will make the time. And I learned later there were 2 Elijah-isms in those statements. One, he said my name. And I learned from listening to him over the next 12 months, almost 12 months, 10 months, that when he said your name, for emphasis, it was to get your attention and say, this thing I'm about to tell you is important. So, and I observed it with other people in his office, people he'd come in, go out, he put a name in it. The other thing is he repeated himself. He said, I'll make the time, Jim. I will make it. And it was almost like a preacher, like his 2 parents. He had a cadence to his speech, and I tried very, very hard when I would look over pieces I had written to say. I read many things out loud to myself to say, does that sound like him? I don't want it to either sound like me or just sound like a neutral voice.
Well, as someone who observed from afar and listened to his speeches on television or being interviewed on television, and having read a good deal of the book, it sounds to me very much like him. So, so thank you
Well,
for
good.
that.
It was an experience, and it was, as much as I'm yakking right now, it was an experience about listening.
And Maya, chapter 8 is yours. And gives us your personal insight into the man. It begins with a little story about how you both how you met and how you got together. This is really 2 questions. It's what was it like to contribute the chapter, and what was it like to tell that intimate story?
It was, certainly welcoming to be asked by the publisher to offer an afterword. I had to write it while campaigning myself for Elijah's seat. And so, it added another layer of responsibility onto an already hectic time. But I was honored to do it because it gave the big picture, I think, the arc of our relationship, as well as kind of like the details of what Elijah had gone through, particularly in terms of his health. And so with that, it was also tough because I had to reflect on some of the more tragic aspects of his, declining health over time. The fact that, clearly, what had been a vibrant, incredible man, his body just gave out, particularly in the end, and especially after Donald Trump's attack on Elijah in the city of Baltimore. Elijah says in the book that the attack actually weakened him. And I actually observed that. It was like a sharp decline after that attack. And so with that, it was just painful recollecting it, but certainly important to also tell the story about Elijah's role as he was dying. He was still legislating. He was still taking calls with Nancy Pelosi. She was still getting his counsel on his sickbed. And asking him about how to structure the impeachment, who should be managers. She was still, thinking that he was going to come back and perhaps have a role. And, it was just, really kind of important, I think, to share that, Elijah, up until almost his last breath, was working to defend our democracy. And I would say that that's commitment, and I would say that that's patriotism. So yeah, I appreciated the opportunity, and certainly, it's something I'll never forget.
If we think about his early life and middle life, the book also reads as a personal narrative and journey through the civil rights movement. And what he experienced in his life. But both of your readings earlier gave us little glimpses of that. I'd like you to react to that, that my take on that the book is also part of that story, as well as being the story of his own life.
Sure, I tried to allude to it when I talked about, how he figured out that the tools of democracy were the key to greater opportunity for African Americans. And certainly, having people like Martin Luther King in his lifetime, being able to hear his speeches and having him influence his thinking. He talked about, listening to Martin Luther King as a young boy and how, that, was a highlight of his week. And then, of course, going to Howard University, which is in Washington, D.C., during the 70s, during the height of the Black Power movement, was just another element of shaping Elijah's thinking and his, in his focus. And of course, that challenge to the system in the civil rights movement of the 60s, the Black Power movement of the 70s, and then the decision of African Americans to really take that Civil Rights Act of 1975 and make it real, not just by voting, but by moving into elected office in ways that would hopefully give them a chance at power that could transform policies and make a bigger difference in the lives of people who had been marginalized and excluded historically in this country. So, what we saw here was Elijah moving into the second Reconstruction. We know that during the first Reconstruction, there were African Americans who entered Congress and tried to make a difference and change. But that actually all ended, ironically enough, after the Compromise of 1776, which, interestingly enough, Ted Cruz used as a justification a couple of weeks ago to actually challenge the 2020 election results. What we know from that compromise is that Americans, through a political compromise, African Americans were then further excluded from opportunities. Anything that they gained after the Civil War was rolled back. And then the Congress people of color, the African-American men who served in Congress during that brief period of the first Reconstruction, left Congress never to be seen again until, in mass, until the 50s with Adam Clayton Powell, the 60s and the 70s. So Elijah, his story is, the civil rights movement in motion. It's the story of, triumph, but it's the story of the ongoing struggle with racial reconciliation that we have in this country. And it's a story that's still being written and litigated in the halls of Congress to this day.
Yeah, Jim, go ahead.
Oh, sure. There's a story that actually bridges generations that relates to Myers taking us through this history. Think about the story that he tells of when he was sworn into Congress, and his father was there, and it's 1996, and he's sworn in, and we've come out of this period of time of the 60s, 70s, 80s, but here is a man who's going to the uppermost levels of government, about to be sworn in. His father is there. And this tells the story of his father saying that when Elijah sees him afterwards, and he's teary, and he says, and of course he's proud of his son, but Elijah looks at him and thinks he must be crying because he's so proud of me. And he is, but he said, when you were there and you raised your hand, I looked at my own hand. And I realized that the blood that runs through you runs through me. And I realized what I could have been, what might have been, what could have been possible. And that was such a moving story, because here was a man at that level. Here's another man who has seen that evolution, but didn't get there, sees what could be. And it's both hopeful and tragic at the very same moment. And one of the things that struck me over and over and over again in working with Elijah, that you just don't see in anybody of any age or color, particularly age, actually, as people get older, you don't see. He was constantly adopting new views in terms of, he said, I remember, that he said when he was running the committee, the reform committee, he said to Nancy Pelosi, give me the young ones. And so he had, I believe, 4 out of 5 members of the infamous squad. He didn't say, I can't deal with that, or they're too strident, or they're too, because he had certainly built a lot of nice relationships across the aisle. He said, give them to me. I'll work with them. I'll learn from them, and they will learn from me. That's a remarkable process for a person to be able to adopt over time. People don't do that. Perhaps they do it in their 20s and 30s.
I'll tie my next question into that comment as well. When we sometimes look to our leaders who have passed on or at the end of their lives, we ask a question about, have we made progress? And we phrase the question in a binary mode, whether it's clearly not going to be a yes or no question. And in reading the book, in looking at Elijah's life, you clearly have this strong character that comes through of someone who was truly bipartisan, could get along with lots of people, but wasn't afraid to call things as he saw them. And that appears to be, another comment on current politics and indeed on the nation, where we've lost an ability to have that level of discourse, to be truly bipartisanship. And so what would his advice be given where we are today? Difficult question, probably a few loaded comments that could be taken in either way. So I'll leave it to both of you to respond to that how you would.
That is a tough one. Maya, I hope you can navigate this one.
Sure, yeah. So, I think that Elijah would have relied on the moral force of the arguments. He would have appealed to people and continue to argue that we're better than this, appealing to their higher angels to snap out of it. Whatever's got you in thrall or in the hold or the grips of, a retrograde force in American politics, that we absolutely have to get beyond it. Our country is at stake. And I think he would have called out the bad faith that Republicans are operating under, because that bad faith requires them to actually basically suspend all of the experiences they've had with people like Elijah and other colleagues who are Black or women or Jewish. And they all know that every stereotype that ideologically extreme members of their party hold about all of these groups are false. They know it because they've had direct experience with people like Elijah and John Lewis and Ruth Bader Ginsburg and many of others. And yet they're still holding, perhaps for political reasons only, to these ideals for the simple purpose of reelection, perhaps, or because they really actually truly believe it, despite having had experiences with people that disprove the notion of white superiority or Christian superiority, or gender, male superiority. So for them to continue to hold these views, continue to operate in this realm of "Make America Great Again," which which was a not so veiled, kind of throwback to the post-Civil War lost cause arguments about, the nation was great when whites were in power. Is to actually operate in total bad faith. And I think Elijah would have called on his, his education and, his moral voice and moral authority to actually help to see a bigger picture. One where we're all in this together and we need to move forward together, united. I don't think that we currently have that moral voice in our public square in a way that has been able to pierce the veil of Donald Trump's influence. And so, we're at an incredibly tenuous point in our nation's history, and it's going to take all of us, the 81 million plus who voted for Biden and Harris, and then those who didn't, but who are so inclined to support, and those who voted for Donald Trump and now regret it because of January 6th. It's going to take all of us to actually say, no, we will not stand for this. Right. We will not basically hawk our children's future and destroy the future of this country based on a lie, based on an antiquated ideology, and certainly not based on a lying president, a former president of the United States of America.
You made this distinction earlier between calling for realizing that while Trumpism had an appeal to some members of, clearly enough to make a $70+ million vote number in the election, but you made this distinction between realizing, is he just ill-suited or is he actually dangerous? And so the moral position that you're, I think, articulating for must get combined with courage of conviction to stand up to that.
We certainly had presidents who were, and people serving in office who were ill-suited, and they were not necessarily competent, but they were also not necessarily dangerous. And I think this was truly an object lesson.
Right.
Many times near the sort of back half of the book or the back half of the story, I would, watching what was going on in the world, in the country, I'd sometimes end a session by saying, Elijah, let me ask you one more thing. Right now, are you feeling optimistic or pessimistic about the future of the country. And this was usually when we had finished a topic, not something going back to his youth, but rather talking about a recent hearing. And as time went on, he would say, I'm pessimistic at the moment. I am optimistic. I remain optimistic long term, but we're going to go through a terrible, terrible period to get there. Mm-hmm. So he had this sort of abiding faith in the morality, but it was going to take a long time for it to come out, and a lot of pain. I wish, and I'm sure he would wish, that he hadn't been quite so accurate in that prediction. But if it's true that we do come out of it, then he would be heartened by that.
I'm going to weave in again.
I just want to quickly say, yesterday was Holocaust Remembrance Day. And I think that, Elijah referred to Trump as having a cruel streak, a streak of cruelty. Mm-hmm. Privately, I think that he viewed the language that Donald Trump used as the language of the Third Reich, the language of Adolf Hitler, in terms of dehumanizing human beings, referring to them as insects, basically conditioning the public to actually think of them as less human. And he viewed him as dangerous to our humanity in that respect, and thought that if he got a second term, that this could lead to tragedies even beyond what we saw at the border, which was quite tragic in and of itself in terms of the separation of children from their families. And so with that, I think that we must all remember what happened in Germany, but we also have to be very sober because we need to realize that it could very well happen here.
And the change of one president to the next is the change of one person. Whereas I think we have a cultural moment to confront that goes beyond one individual at the top. The first question I want to take from the audience, and I do want to, there's some beautiful pictures in the book as well, so I want to share a couple of those in a few minutes. But the first question really asks, and this is the difference between compromise and changing someone's mind. Did Representative Cummings ever feel he had changed a Republican representative's mind? Maybe you have an example or a thought that would respond to that question.
That's an interesting. I asked questions like that had to do with communication. In Congress, I'm going to try to be as fair as I can be. For either side, it's hard to say out loud, so-and-so changed my mind. It is more often the case that someone ends up changing a vote because of a rationalization that they create that is somehow they craft in such a way that they feel it'll be acceptable to the spectrum of their constituency. So it's pretty rare that you're going to have someone, do a John McCain and give a thumbs down vote in an unexpected or somewhat unexpected situation. There certainly were times, I know, and Maya may be able to recount some specifics, times when conversations that Elijah had with members of Congress, and they reached a position where they could agree on certain issues or positions. I mean, his position on the cost of prescription drugs and having an open negotiation a la Medicare was something that some Republicans quietly agreed with, not so. But the fear factor that we still see today in this leadership, this cult leadership, was terrifying. And it made it much more difficult for those members of across the aisle to say out loud what they might have believed. We saw today and yesterday, Kevin McCarthy, who made a sort of a lukewarm negative statement about the president, felt he had to fly down to Florida to beg for forgiveness, because what he did for one moment is he told a little fragment of the truth. So that fear was there. I would say Elijah certainly, and Maya is well aware of it, had some friendships, true friendships across the aisle, some unlikely ones. And he could have conversations and he could find some common ground. But I think changing minds is, we've created an atmosphere where it's very hard to admit you've changed your mind.
Maybe we could just bring up the first picture that we have, because it goes to this point. I think it's the John Boehner, President Obama, and Elijah picture, which in some ways, in a visual, captures what we're talking about. And what I recall from an earlier time is where you would have a disagreement about policy, you would have a difference of opinion about how to proceed. But it wasn't about power necessarily, at least not overtly. Maybe it always was, and some of us are just waking up to that. But this is actually this is John Boehner and Maya and Elijah. So January 2015.
Yeah, so he was the Speaker of the House at the time. Of course, it was before Donald Trump was ever elected to office. But Elijah, he liked John Boehner. He liked George W. Bush. There are many Republicans. Elijah had the amazing ability to separate what happened on the floor of the House or politics or even policy positions from his personal views about the people. So, he separated the behavior from the person. And oftentimes he would connect with Republicans because on the level of the personal, through the gym, they would see each other and just start chatting about family and, then get to the issues, but always, kind of shoot the breeze and off the record. And so with that, I think that what's happened is that, we've entered a period where politics, I call it asymmetrical political warfare, asymmetrical partisan warfare, where, Republicans have been now willing to, go to any length, using any means and at all costs to actually, win. And so, we've seen them, even before Donald Trump, that we've seen them deny a sitting president of the United States his power to actually appoint a Supreme Court justice. We've seen all kinds of things happen where they bent the rules or changed the rules ad hoc just to actually hold on to power. Now, you can view this as the last gasp of a party that, would rather actually use voter suppression tactics and other, tactics to hold on to power, or you can view it as the strong arm Machiavellian tactics of a party that is determined to hold power at all costs, and then to drive forward into a future where they will actually demand the public's fealty to an unpopular policy agenda.
We have a picture to go from contrast to allies of John Lewis and Elijah together. And I think the caption in the book talks about how the media would continuously mix them up for each other, which is both terribly embarrassing and I think something we should be far beyond, and yet this twin idea is kind of humorous as well. How did Elijah think? Did he laugh that off, or did he find it annoying, or what was that like?
Both.
Yeah, and rightly so, right?
Yeah. He considered it an honor because, to be confused with the great John Lewis, who wouldn't want to be, but he also, laughed it off, especially earlier in his career. But then also he considered it an annoyance too, because he wanted to make his own mark. And so, he wanted people to know him for him and to distinguish himself as a leader. So he experienced all of those emotions over time.
There are two images I will go to, and then we'll walk our way through the questions for the balance of our time. His roots in Baltimore are really, really strong, and I think we have an image, which maybe I think you took perhaps, of him at the Freddie Gray protests, trying to calm down, or at least work with the reporters and the protesters. Can you tell us a little bit about that moment?
Yeah, so what people don't realize is that the moment was, I think this might have been the night where the prosecutor here in town actually announced that they were going to press charges against the police. And what people don't realize is that it was a party. People were happy. The residents of Baltimore, West Baltimore, were joyous that finally these police would be held accountable. Now, what nobody knew at that time is that, the Obama Justice Department would go on to actually open up patterns and practices investigation, looking into the Baltimore City Police. And then they would go on to find that there was a corruption ring operating within the Baltimore City Police that has now led to more than 10 police officers being convicted and sent to prison. And so, what we do know at that time was that the people of West Baltimore, primarily African-American, were fed up. The story of Freddie Gray had been the story of too many other people that they knew who were unjustly stopped, apprehended, arrested, mistreated, and they wanted accountability. And they got it. And that night, what you saw were reporters from around the world who had descended on Baltimore to actually see what was going on and to experience it himself. And Elijah put his body on the line, out there night after night, standing between the protesters and the police to make sure nobody was hurt, but also that both sides could, that the people of Baltimore could be heard.
So it would be mischaracterization to call this unrest or protest on this particular night, but the ongoing experience was clearly mixed.
Yeah, no, there was real. I mean, we had here in the city, we had tanks lined up on the streets. We had phalanxes of police officers in full riot gear who were lined up, to prevent, the people from, getting past a certain line. It was incredible. You would think you would have seen that kind of build up on the steps of the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. Instead, you saw it on a street corner in front of a CVS in Baltimore City in 2015.
Well, I think that certainly points to one aspect of January 6th that people have, rightly or wrongly, were shocked at: the disparity in how different types of protests were treated or prepared for, and the distinction along racial lines is just so stark.
African Americans are often treated like the enemy within. African American communities, are often treated by police and the arm of the state as if they're an occupying force in our communities. And so, with that, they're just groups of folks who are just trying to get equality and trying to live a good life. And so, when you actually see people who are actually a lynch mob, they're erecting, gallows outside of the Capitol. They're going in to basically to abscond with and potentially kill U.S. legislators, and that there were all kinds of warnings and indications of their intent before they arrived, and they could just walk in almost with no, it's just the double standards are not just incredible, but this is bad faith. This is, if you're watching and you've ever had a question about what African Americans are talking about in terms of how they're treated in this country versus whites, you saw it in operation and a clear example on January 6th.
If we look from January 6th, where later that night into the early morning, I think perhaps, the election was certified, and we roll forward to January 20th. We have an inauguration that happened peacefully on the day. What would Elijah want to see, or what would he have thought of that day?
Of the 20th?
Of the 20th?
I'd be happy. I mean, tough way to get there, but he would be, I'm sure he'd be reassured that there was a glimmer of hope that we would survive, but he would also not be relieved and say, okay, everything's okay now. Yeah. I mean, you couldn't possibly be, he couldn't be, and you know, this is a moment of high alert, to say the least. I mean, it's hard to put words and thoughts in his mouth, but I think that, Maya, you could imagine that during that inauguration, he would be, it would be the definition of bittersweet. You know, it would be a good thing, but we're not there. And this sense of unity that Biden has said over and over and over and over again is what's needed, but it's so fragile. If possible, it's fragile.
Absolutely.
And it is a call for unity, but a unity with accountability.
Yes,
I think is the balance.
No question about it. I mean, if we look at the events of January 6th, one of the most shocking things to me is that the very people who were threatened, Republican people who were threatened, highly right-wing people who were threatened have sort of said, well, I have to forget the fact that I was terrified. I'm gonna pretend I wasn't. I'm gonna pretend this didn't happen, or pretend this wasn't that bad, or that this wasn't really a threat. Well, it's take away the Democrats. Take away, what are they thinking? Did this not occur?
They're operating in bad faith. That is bad faith. And it's a form of gaslighting. It's gaslighting that African-American communities experience all the time, but now they're gaslighting the nation and the world.
It's astonishing. It's like voluntary amnesia.
So one of the aspects of our democracy is voter participation. And one of the challenges on that front is the concept and the reality of attempted or real voter suppression. And so one of our questions from the audience is this something that Elijah spoke about, or how would he advise us to fight against it?
He spoke about it all the time, and talked about how his mother on her deathbed exhorted him to, pled with him to not let them take away our right to vote. And so, you know, Elijah viewed it as his personal mission to fight against voter suppression. He would have viewed, and he would have been absolutely right, that this Republican effort to lie about the election results was actually the ultimate form of voter suppression, because attempted voter suppression, because what they were trying to do was deny the voice and the vote of primarily Black and brown voters in Georgia and Michigan and Pennsylvania and Nevada. And so, you know, with that, you know, it's just the same playbook, but on a broader scale. And so, you know, with that, you know, Elijah believed firmly that we needed to not only restore the Voting Rights Act, which was gutted by the U.S. Supreme Court, the Roberts-led court back in 2013, I believe. He would have wanted to restore, especially, you know, Section 5, which was the heart of the Voting Rights Act, but also to even go further, to strengthen it. And I actually argue that we actually need to have a constitutional guarantee. We need to amend our US Constitution to guarantee free and fair elections. And so, you know, there's a lot of work that we've got to do now that we see how our democracy can be derailed. There's a lot of democracy building work we need to do legislatively and constitutionally to make sure a Donald Trump era never happens again. And Elijah would have been at the forefront of that.
We have this question, which begins with a statement and then a question at the end. As a person who grew up in the 1960s, when we all marched together for peace and love and sang songs of unity, it seems to me that we are in a, I'm sorry, I just lost my place. It seems to me that we are in a worse place now than we were then. We are more divided than I remember during the height of the Vietnam War. Brian Stevenson has said, slavery didn't end, it just evolved. But recent events seem to indicate that that evolution is actually going backwards. Yet John Lewis entreated us to remain hopeful. Are you still hopeful? And what do you do to maintain your hope? And maybe I'd like both of you to respond to that.
Yes, I'm hopeful, but it's hard. Here's what makes me hopeful. Here's one side of the coin. We talked about voter suppression. What we just saw in this election makes me somewhat hopeful because all the efforts at voter suppression didn't work. Because Georgia happened, because Pennsylvania happened and Michigan happened, but there's no clearer, sharper picture than Georgia. That terrifies people who would like to have voter suppression, and I'm happy that it means it was successful if they're terrified. Trying to find a silver lining here, but yes, I'm hopeful, but I think you can't you have to keep working. I'll go back to this person who talked about the 60s. Things in hindsight seem better. That was a scary period too, and it was only through work and dedication and relentless effort that any progress was made. And then we obviously fell backward. But this is a time to be somewhat hopeful, to see what's possible and build on it. Don't say, okay, we got through this. We didn't get through this. We got up to this point.
That's right. We can't forget Kamala Harris. I mean, the first ever South Asian, African, or Black American woman to become to be Vice President of the United States of America. Certainly, she's symbolic of progress. But as Jen stated, the efforts that we saw, even though they were not successful, we now know that there's a backlash coming. That, in Republican-controlled state legislatures in Georgia and around the country, they're now considering how to actually restrict the right to vote even further, to prevent Black and brown people from having a greater voice in the future, and from doing what they did in the 2020 election all over again. Backlash coming. We saw yesterday, I think it was the Department of Homeland Security issued a warning about the violence that is expected in larger society from people who are disaffected by the results of the election and other things, white supremacists among them. So we know that backlash historically has meant further oppression, repression, and even murder in the form of lynchings. And so now our obligation this time around is to actually to avoid repeating that history and to take steps to go in a new direction and to ensure that this time we reach an enduring multicultural democracy.
There's one more image from the book, because I think our college years for any of us that go to college become very formative. And we have a picture of Elijah speaking to members of the Howard University choir in downtown Washington, D.C. I'm assuming this is pretty late in his life. And could you just tell us a little bit about what's the significance of this particular picture to include in the book?
Elijah always talked to young people. His quote was, "Children are the living messages we send to a future we will never see." And he would spend, he would make sure he prioritized his time to support young people, to talk to young people, to support their advancement, to serve as a bridge to the future. And so we were actually not there, for these young people. We were there for an event that was being sponsored nearby. We were passing by and we looked up and saw the Howard students. Elijah stopped impromptu to give them a speech they never asked for. But he felt like they must hear because he wanted to encourage them and to, to let them know that he, wanted to encourage them to, be great.
And my final question really relates to the very end of the book, where you've included excerpts of eulogies for Elijah. This is an amazing set of statements. And I'm just wondering if there's something that struck you or was surprising about who wrote or what was written and then what you included.
Maya again. It was. I'll just say this: it was the most incredible time, one after another, of these people speaking with this passion, and not just the famous people. Although you could not be, it was impossible not to be impressed by this lineup. But Maya's own eulogy, the pastor's eulogy, the family members, the staff members from Elijah's staff it was an unbelievable moment. I do. There's one phrase that stuck with me, although there are many if I went back through it, but there was one that Obama said. There was a picture and it said, "The Honorable Elijah Cummings."
That's the one that stuck with me too.
He said, "The Honorable Elijah Cummings," and he said, "That's a title. That's what you get called." He said, "But Elijah was honorable way, way before he had the title. He just was an honorable person. He was an honorable man." And I thought, well, that's about the highest compliment anyone could ever get. And it was the whole audience sort of just, that one stuck with me.
Maya, it sounds like that was yours as well? Or?
Yeah, that was mine as well. Jim actually made the selections, but I think I would have made the same excerpted selections from the, I've had people tell me that they watched that funeral over and over again. It was publicly available. I think it ran on C-SPAN and some other platforms. But, that some people watched it several times, I thought was pretty interesting. But, I lived it. And I think that he would have been proud of his homegoing. I think that he would have been honored by the people who showed up for him. And I'm certainly, proud of the life he lived and the legacy he left.
Our producers just snuck in a final question, and it's on a slightly forward-looking note. It says, "When we can travel again, what should we visit in Baltimore?"
There's a lot.
There's the
Anything
Inner
that was,
Harbor. There's the Inner Harbor, which has, a couple of cool museums around it, like the Museum of Science. There's a maritime industry museum. There's, all kinds of shopping. Also, the National Aquarium is in the Baltimore Inner Harbor. There's the Baltimore Museum of Art. As a former board member of the Baltimore Museum of Art, I always encourage people to go visit. It's got an incredible collection that you absolutely must not miss, especially if you like, the Impressionist painters. We've got the Walters Museum of Art, which also has an incredible collection. There's also, more, eclectic choices like the Blacks and Wax Museum. It's a really nifty museum where you can see wax figures of historical African Americans, and I encourage you to visit there if you get a chance to come by. there are all kinds of sites, both natural and man-made, that I would encourage you to check out when you come.
Awesome. So let me just close by simply thanking both of you for sharing Elijah with us tonight. The book is an amazing read, and I encourage everybody to go borrow or buy a copy of it. Thank you for sharing yourselves with us tonight. And to our audience, thank you for joining us. While many of us may not have known him personally, our democracy feels the loss and the loss of his kind deeply. We hope to see his like again. So for tonight, thank you. Be safe. Be well. See you next time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.